Good day, friends. I'm here to talk today about some really landmark results. And these landmark results are results from the Landmark study, which has been assessing trends in diabetes care, diabetes management, and diabetes complications across the country. Today, we'll speak about diabetes complications and the gradient between persons living with type 2 diabetes in metropolitan cities versus non metropolitan cities of India. These are our disclosures. Now, why we set out to do this was because, as we know, we have the second highest diabetes disease burden in the world. We are also aware that in India, the prevalence of diabetes is more in the urban centers as compared to the rural population. Though many states, like Kerala, for example, do not have any gradient at all. Not only do we have a burden of diabetes, we also have a high burden of diabetes complications, both acute and chronic. In chronic, both macro and microvascular. But data on diabetes related complications in persons with type 2 diabetes uh, is unavailable if we want to compare metropolitan with non metropolitan cities. So, therefore, we tried to do a subsidiary analysis of our data from the Landmark study. Our aim was to find out what the prevalence was of both these vascular complications in the larger and the smaller cities. Landmark is a 3-year nationwide study, a multicentric study with a prospective observational study design. It mirrors real-life diabetes management patterns in the country. For inclusion, participants had to have diabetes for at least 2 years, had to be taking at least 2 anti-hyperglycemic medications, and had to be in the age bracket of 25 to 60 years. Data was taken for study visits conducted every 6 months, and the endpoints were complications reported during a 1-year follow-up period. For definition, the following 6 cities were taken as metropolitans: Bengaluru, Chennai, New Delhi, Hyderabad, Kolkata, and Mumbai. And all other study centers were included in the non-metropolitan group. We screened upwards of 6,000 participants. Evaluable datasets were for 6,236 participants at baseline and 5,654 participants at the end of 1 year. And we studied 382 sites across our nation. Out of the 6,236 patients that we included, 2,378 were from metros, 3,858 were from non-metros, respectively. The age of our participants, duration of diabetes, and baseline HbA1c was comparable across all cities. But when we looked at complications, this data struck us. Microvascular complications were statistically significantly more prevalent in persons living in non-metros. 19.1% risk of complications in non-metros as compared to 10.9% in the metros. When we looked at macrovascular complications as a whole, there was similarity. Equal prevalence of macrovascular complications in the metros and the non-metros. We tried to assess these complications separately, and we found that neuropathy, nephropathy, and retinopathy, all three were significantly higher in non-metropolitan residents. Acute coronary syndrome, however, was also higher in the non-metropolitan cities, even though the overall risk of macrovascular complications was similar. So, acute coronary syndrome was more in non-metros, but myocardial infarction, stroke, and peripheral vascular disease, these had a similar prevalence in the larger cities and the smaller ones. This data is important. First of all, the study design is robust. It is a longitudinal study which reports real-world trends. For the first time, we've tried to assess what the difference is between our larger and smaller cities. And we found that persons with type 2 diabetes living in non-metros may have a high risk of diabetes complications, especially all the 3 microvascular dysfunctions, that is neuropathy, nephropathy, and retinopathy, and also acute coronary syndrome. Out of all the complications, it is neuropathy which seems to be the most common in both metros and non-metros. This data is important because it gives guidance to policymakers, to health planners, and also to diabetes care professionals. If you are a diabetes care professional living in India, working in India, if you are a person who has to plan the health needs for our country, if you're a policymaker for our country, you cannot ignore chronic complications. And especially if you're looking after non-metros, you need to create the infrastructure to manage not only neuropathy, but also nephropathy and retinopathy. We should act now, because if we do not provide access to our patients now, then when will we do it? Thank you.
Now we are moving ahead for the next paper. For the next paper, Dr. Anupama Hegde is there, and she will going to speak for assessment of biochemical associates of endothelial function in pre-diabetes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Okay. Should I share this screen? My screen is visible?
Yeah, it is visible.
One second. How do I switch on the video? Good afternoon. I'm going to speak on assessment of biochemical associates of endothelial function in pre-diabetes. This was done in the Department of Biochemistry and Medicine in Kasturba Medical College, Mangalore, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Manipal. Now, today's focus is on pre-diabetes. As we know, pre-diabetes is a state between normalcy and hyperglycemia. Pre-diabetes could be either impaired fasting glucose, impaired glucose tolerance, or existence of both the conditions together. We will mainly concentrate on cardiovascular disease risk. As we know, the conditions or the pro-inflammatory status which is present in diabetes, that is dyslipidemia, obesity, hypertension, dysglycemia, insulin resistance, all these conditions pre-exist in pre-diabetes. So all of these lead to endothelial dysfunction. Endothelial dysfunction in turn results because of inflammatory status or pro-inflammatory status in pre-diabetes patients. The cardiovascular disease risk is a result of endothelial dysfunction, and this could be due to the loss of balance between vasodilation and vasoconstriction status, which can be assessed by nitric oxide, ADMA, that is asymmetric dimethylarginine, endothelin 1, or imbalance between growth promoting and inhibiting factors, which could be assessed by markers such as E-selectin and ICAM1, or the presence of procoagulant state, which can be assessed by plasminogen activator inhibitor 1 and von Willebrand factor. These were the markers that we chose to assess the presence of endothelial dysfunction. So the aim of the study was to assess the biochemical associates of endothelial function in prediabetes, and the objective was to estimate insulin and all these markers in 3 groups of subjects, that is normal, prediabetes and diabetes subjects, and compare between them. The second aim was to correlate these markers with the glycemic indices in each of these groups. So although 600 subjects were scanned in the age group of 25 to 45 years, we could get only 114 subjects based on their fasting plasma glucose and HbA1c values. So they were divided further into 3 groups. as either pre-diabetes, healthy controls, or diabetes based on the FPG and A1C values. Now, these were the methods by which the analysis was done. Fasting plasma glucose and A1C was done using automated analyzers. HOMA-IR was calculated and other estimates were done by ELISA. This was the method, and the results were as such. We could see that the fasting plasma glucose was significantly different based on the selection criteria. But we can also see here that the insulin levels are higher in pre-diabetes and much more higher in diabetic population. And the HOMA-IR is, of course, higher in diabetes and pre-diabetes. Now, the markers of endothelial dysfunction, which were based on nitric oxide, were compared between the three groups. So you can see here that nitric oxide levels were higher in diabetic population, while ADMA was lower in diabetic population. And pre-diabetic group had higher nitric oxide levels and lower ADMA levels as compared to the normal control groups. The endothelin 1, which was compared again between the three groups, again you can see that higher levels of endothelin in pre-diabetes and much more higher level in diabetic population. The markers of endothelial activation and damage were compared between the groups. So under that we have E-selectin. E-selectin also was found to be much higher in pre-diabetes and diabetes group. And the other molecular marker, that is ICAM1, was also found to be much raised in pre-diabetes and even much higher in diabetes population. The markers of coagulant status or procoagulant status, that is plasminogen activator inhibitor 1 and von Willebrand factor, was also measured. So the diabetics and pre-diabetics were found to be in the procoagulant state. The correlation was studied between all these molecular markers to the glycemic indices in all the three groups, and the healthy population or the healthy controls, we could not establish any correlation between the glycemic indices and these molecular markers. Whereas in pre-diabetes group, we can see here that there was a good degree of correlation between the molecular markers and the fasting plasma glucose levels as compared to the diabetic group, where the correlation was very less. Only few molecular markers correlated to the fasting plasma glucose. So pre-diabetes has high fasting insulin as compared to healthy controls, and pre-diabetes also had higher insulin resistance as compared to healthy controls, but much lesser than the diabetic group. These are the established factors. Now, nitric oxide was found to be highly decreased in diabetic group and significantly higher in healthy controls. The levels were also found to be lesser in pre-diabetic group. Now, enhanced nitric oxide production by induction and reduced inhibition of eNOS is supposed to be the mechanism of nitric oxide synthesis. Similarly, ADMA, that is asymmetric dimethylarginine and endothelin 1, were also found to be significantly decreased in diabetic group as well as in pre-diabetes group. So nitric oxide had a positive correlation with FPG, which states that hyperglycemia is responsible for increased nitric oxide levels, and nitric oxide also positively correlated with fasting plasma insulin and HOMA-IR levels, suggesting that alteration in nitric oxide signaling exists in case of high insulin and insulin resistance conditions. ADMA was negatively correlated with FPG. So this has shown that ADMA is higher in healthy controls, lesser in diabetics and pre-diabetics. So this was also found in earlier studies. Endothelin 1 had a positive correlation. So higher fasting plasma glucose and insulin levels are increasing the endothelin 1 levels, and this in turn is related to production of ROS, mainly superoxide anions in the vasculature. So E-selectin-1 and ICAM-1 were found to be significantly decreased in diabetic group as compared to healthy controls, and PA1 and 1 millibrand factor also had a significant decrease in diabetic and pre-diabetic group. So these observations, these were the observations. There was significantly statistically significant correlation of fasting plasma glucose, insulin, and A1C in the pre-diabetes group, which suggests a role of chronic hyperglycemia and increased insulin levels in the development of endothelial dysfunction, which is supposed to be a link between the cardiovascular disease risk. So hyperglycemia, increased insulin levels, or insulin resistance predisposes to endothelial damage and mandates preventive measures to be taken at this level to prevent further irreversible changes and complications of diabetes. So at the level of pre-diabetes, we have observed a lot of endothelial dysfunction to be seen. So the limitations of the study was it was a cross-sectional study and only impaired fasting glucose subjects were enrolled. The sample size in individual group was small, maybe estimation of non-biochemical parameters such as maybe FMD or intima media thickness could further add to this study. Scope of the study is follow-up studies, and inclusion of non-biochemical parameters can further substantiate the findings. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will welcome our expert, Dr. Deepak Dalal and Dr. Ramchandani, GD Ramchandani sir. And for the next paper, would like to invite Dr. Ritika Verma, and she is going to speak on real-world effectiveness of Diabifly digital therapeutics program for improving glycemic control in people with type 2 diabetes. Over to you, Dr. Ritika.
Thank you, Dr. Dharmendra. I hope, sir, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, there. Your screen is there. You
Okay.
can go full screen.
Right.
Yeah, it is there. Perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Ritika Verma, and I'm going to be presenting my abstract titled Real-World Effectiveness of Diabifly Digital Therapeutics Program for Improving Glycemic Control in People with Type 2 Diabetes. These are the authors for this abstract. Okay. Coming to So India is among the top 3 countries in the world for people with diabetes, and in 2019, 77 million of people with diabetes were in India, which is expected to increase to 101 million by 2030. This increasing prevalence in diabetes has been attributed to many factors like aging, rapid urbanization, and increase in various risk factors like obesity, lack of physical activity, or unhealthy lifestyle. So the aim of the study was aimed at the exploration of the real-world effectiveness of Diabifly digital therapeutics platform for improving the glycemic control in people with type 2 diabetes, wherein we want to address the problem that the poor glycemic control in people with diabetes remains a major challenge in developing countries like India, which with a huge burden of diabetes and lack of personalized and continuous care. Digital therapeutics platforms are highly accessible and cost-effective platforms, which are evidence-based intervention and can help in better management of diabetes through the use of high-quality software. So coming to the digital therapeutics programs, which are emerging as a solution worldwide, in the diabetes management, a DTX program can help by providing the participants with personalized nutrition plan, exercise and fitness guidance, sleep and stress management, monitoring and compliance in terms of meals, in terms of physical activity and medication reminders, education in terms of diabetes self-management, and motivation and support. In this study, we have assessed the effectiveness of DiabeFly Digital Therapeutics Program, which incorporates a technology aspect along with the human services aspect. In the technology aspect, the FitterFly mobile application provided the participants with an analysis of the meal in terms of calories, micro and macronutrients. The app provided the participants with an ability to digitally log their clinical and anthropometric data like blood glucose, HbA1c, weight, BMI, and the app also provided diabetes education and lessons to participants through clinically established, based on clinically established evidence. The coach platform helped in providing the remote health coaches with a better visualization of the personal data of patients and helped them to communicate with them in a more personalized manner. In terms of human services, the remote care team provided support through nutritionist, physiotherapist, and psychologist, so to provide a 360-degree care to all the participants. In the methodology, this is a 90 days program, which was a structured plan towards lifestyle and behavioral coaching for diabetes management. In the day 1 to day 10 of the program, assessment phase was conducted, wherein the participants were analyzed for their dietary behavior, physical status, and mental status. After that, in the therapy phase, the interventions, whether manual or digital, were provided to all the participants. And in the transformation phase, in the areas where participants needed more help, it was provided to all the participants. And in the achievement phase, which was the day 75 to 90, all the goals that was achieved by all the participants were reviewed, and a maintenance plan was provided to all of them for a long-term behavior change. Coming to the material and method of the work, 126 participants were included in this study, and the de-identified data of all these participants were analyzed. 55% of the participants were female with a mean age of 45 years. The primary outcome of the study was to study the change in the HbA1c, weight, and BMI after completion of the program as compared to the initial when the participants just joined the program. The participants had a mean BMI of 27 kg per meter square and a mean HbA1c of 8.7% and weight of about baseline mean weight of 75.6 kgs. Coming to the results, after the completion of the program, a significant mean reduction in HbA1c by 1.63% was observed from a baseline of 8.7% and 7% in all the participants, which was statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.001. 90% of the participants reduced their HbA1c, and out of which 54% of these participants who reduced their HbA1c, reduction of greater than 1% was observed. The weight of the participant showed a mean reduction by 2.38 kg from a baseline of 75 kg. 63% of the participants reduced their weight post the program, and out of these participants, 30% showed a weight reduction of at least 5 kgs. A mean reduction in BMI by 0.83 kg per meter square was found out in all these participants, which was statistically significant. 63% of the participants reduced BMI after program participation. I would also like to present one of the case study from one of these participants, wherein the participant was a 50-year-old male and was recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes with a baseline HbA1c of 9% and was having hypertension since 10 years. The main concern was high HbA1c, and he was overweight. He was on medication of OHs. Intervention and support was provided through nutritionists by providing a well-balanced diet, through physiotherapists by providing pain management, and that led to 94% improvement in the total fitness score. And a psychologist support was provided for psychological well-being that led to 31% reduction in the emotional distress of the participants. The outcome shown by this participant showed 2.2% reduction in HbA1c from 9% to 6.8% after the 90 days program. Weight was reduced by 8 kgs, and FBS reduction was by 30 mg per deciliter from 150 to 120, and there was a significant improvement in the physical activity level of the participant. So to conclude the study, after 90 days on the program, significant reduction in HbA1c by 1.36% was achieved, and weight reduction by 2.38 kgs, and BMI by 0.83 kg per meter square was observed. An improvement in glycemic control in people with type 2 diabetes was observed. And as the reduction in HbA1c shows that there was a reduction that will lead to a reduction in risk of diabetes-related complications. Thus, the DiabeFly digital therapeutics program helped in effective diabetes self-management, education, and support. Thank you. Please do share your questions with me.
If we have any questions from expert.
Yeah, so sorry for this.
If no question, we shall move ahead for the next paper. For the next paper, I would like to invite Dr. Manoj Khokar, and he's going to speak for his study of combinatory approach of clinical and interactomic analysis to understand the role of NF-κB beta-1 in diabetic nephropathy. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Manoj.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are audible.
My slide is visible?
Yeah, it is visible.
Thank you, sir. This study is completed in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, the guidance of Dr. Purvi Purohit. Title of this study is a combinatory approach of a clinical and interactomics analysis to understand the role of NF-κB1 in diabetic nephropathy. Background: diabetic nephropathy, a metabolic complication of diabetes involved in renal system, affect a large percentage of the population worldwide. Hyperglycemia stimulates phosphomethyl inositol 3 kinase and the protein kinase B AKT pathway with subsequent activations of mTOR. Activated mTOR is responsible for basement membrane thickening, mesangial matrix expansions, and renal fibrosis. In our previous paper, we presented in diabetes, microRNA cause a myocardial fibrosis by simultaneously increasing the oxidative stress, which activate the NF-κB1 pathway and cause the prevascular fibrosis through CTGF activation. It also downregulates DUSP8, MMP9, SOD2, and LAZ3, and upregulated cyclin D and EMT, further contributing to diabetic cardiomyopathy and diabetic nephropathy. Hyperglycemia activates nuclear factor kappa B1, which play a key role in the pathogenesis of a vascular complication in diabetes. Objective of this study constructed an in silico molecular network of NF-κB1 gene with its interactions and their function, enrichment, and gene ontology. The study validated the expression of NF-κB1 in clinical samples of patients with type 2 diabetes and diabetic nephropathy by comparing with the publicly available similar database. Methods. Here we search the data sets from the two databases. First is the GEO related type 2 diabetes database sets, found the 2 data sets, and the another database is the LINCS data portal. Here found 2 data sets related to type 2 diabetes and diabetic nephropathy. And after then, the co-differential NFKB1 mRNA expression is found, and the NFKB1 construct of the protein-protein interaction network, and after then analysis the KGG pathway, biological process, cellular components, and molecular functions. And after then, fold change expression is analyzed, and this is validated in our clinical samples. In the NFKB1's fold change expression validate in the human clinical samples, and we take 3 types of groups for our study. First is the 35 samples for diabetic nephropathy, 39 samples type 2 diabetes, and 37 samples of healthy controls. And after then isolate the RNA and then convert into the cDNA by reverse transcription PCRs, and then convert after then check the expression of real-time gene expression of NF-kappa B by the RT-PCRs, and analysis of the fold change expression, the clinical samples fold change expression compared with the in silico data sets, and after then validate the microRNA targets. Methods: the study recruit total 111 participants, age and sex matched, healthy with the healthy controls, and from a tertiary care center in the Western Rajasthan. Anthropometrics measurements and the biochemical profiles including FBS, serum, insulin were measured, and thermoscientific TM DreamTech TM Green's PCR master mix kit was used for assessing the NFKB1 expressions, and the delta CT value were calculated using the GAP-DH as an internal control, and statistical analysis was done using the SPSS version 23 software, and p-value is 0.05 was considered to be statistically significant. Results: firstly, we demonstrate from the string database NFKB1 to be interact with the 10 genes like EP300, STELA, NFKB2, PPARG, NFKBIA, SDEC1, CHUK, RELs, RELB, NFKBIB. After then, KGG pathway analysis showing that all 11 genes were enriched in NFKB1 signaling pathway like insulin resistance, age-raised signaling pathway in diabetic complications, and PI3-AKT mTOR signaling pathway, and gene and ontology also yield similar results. Based on a highest degree and betweenness, we identified the 4 microRNA HSMIR 7-FIP, HSMIR 15-FIP, HSMIR 16-FIP, HSMIR 21-FIP of the top target of NFKB1. NFKB1 was observed to be upregulated in diabetic nephropathy in the 1.18-fold change in GDS9061 datasets and 1.19-fold change in GSE142025 datasets. And another, when compared to the healthy controls, the expression of NFKB1 was upregulated in type 2 diabetes as document in the studies, the 1.18-fold change expression in the GSE156993 datasets and 1.13-fold change expression in GS9006 datasets. And in our clinical samples, we demonstrated that the 1.50-fold change upregulated in type 2 diabetes and 1.70-fold change upregulated of NFKB1 in circulating blood cells when compared with the healthy control populations. Conclusion of this study: this combinatory clinical and genomic study demonstrated that NFKB1 to be upregulated in type 2 diabetes and diabetic nephropathy, and identified the gene interacting with NFKB1. Apart from the NFKB signaling pathway, these identified genes were found to have a crucial role in the insulin resistance, the age-raised signaling pathway in diabetic complications, and PI3-AKT signaling pathway. And in addition, we also identified the top microRNA HSMIR7-FIP, HSMIR15-FIP, HSMIR16-FIP, and MIR21-FIP that can target of NFKB1. Thank you. Welcome for questions.
Thank you for your paper. Do we have any questions? Fine. We are moving ahead for the next paper. For the next paper, would like to invite Dr. Javed Bhatt, and he's going to speak on glycemic status at the presentation and its role as a marker of severity and outcome in patient with organophosphorus poisoning. Over to you, Dr. Javed. Do we have Dr. Javed? Is there? Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible.
Is screen visible to you?
Yes, screen is perfectly visible.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, respected teachers. I'm Dr. Javed Ahmed Bhatt. I will be presenting the role of glycemic status as a marker of severity and outcome in patients with organophosphorus poisoning.
Dr. Javed, if you can put it on screen, slides mode, full screen mode.
Just a minute, sir.
Yeah,
Is
perfect.
it okay now?
Yes, perfect.
As we all are aware that deliberate self-harm is a major problem in the developing world, and poisoning is one of the most common methods employed for the act. Among the poisons, organophosphorus compounds are the commonest agents that contribute to the majority of the poisoning cases. And as per the estimates, 50% of the cases of poisoning in Asia are because of these organophosphorus compounds. It is one of the commonest poisoning in India, with nearly half of the emergency admissions because of this, as per the data from the hospital-based studies are concerned. It's a significant cause of morbidity and mortality, with a case fatality rate of 10 to 20% in developing countries. And one of the studies from All India Institute of Medical Science from India has estimated that the case fatality rate extended up to 28%. So despite the advancements in the management of the organophosphorus poisoning cases, mortality and morbidity is significantly high in these patients. And with ever increasing number of both intentional and unintentional poisoning, with the WHO estimates presenting that there is the prevalence of around 3 million cases per year, resulting in the death of 2.5 to 3 lakh people per year. So this is a huge number. So there's a requirement for an effective and inexpensive method to assist the emergency personnel to prognosticate the patient and predict the outcome. Though various predictors of mortality in these patients have been identified, like GCS score, Apache score, POP scale, the role of glycemic status in determining the risk of mortality is not yet clear, despite the fact that the fluctuations and extremes of glycemia has been found to be a very significant parameter that determines the outcome in critically ill patients. So the aim of our study was to assess the severity of poisoning with the established scales like Paradynia organophosphorus scale and the level of serum cholinesterase, which gets depressed with the organophosphorus poisoning, and to assess the glycemic status by estimating the random plasma glucose at the time of admission, in addition to the clinical parameters, to correlate the documented blood glucose levels with the severity and the clinical outcome. This study was a prospective observational study involving 400 patients aged more than 18 years over a period of 2 years in a department, emergency department of Government Medical College, Srinagar. In addition to the clinical parameters, biochemical parameters, including random sugar levels, serum cholinesterase levels, severity and outcome were determined. And on the basis of glycemic status at the presentation, patients were grouped into hypoglycemics, euglycemics, and hyperglycemics. This glycemic status was later on correlated with the severity and clinical outcome of the patients. Our observations were there was a significant female preponderance in our study. 88% of the patients belonged to the rural areas, as is evident from the fact that these rural areas have the abundance of organophosphoric availability, and easy low cost adds to the these availability. Suicide was the most common motive, and ingestion was the most common mode of poisoning. As far as the age was concerned, 65% of the patients were in the age group of 18 to 35. So younger age group was mainly involved. Based on the this Paradinia organophosphorus poisoning scale score, mild poisoning was seen in 50% of the patients, 35% had moderate poisoning, and 15% of the patients were having severe poisoning. Similarly, on the basis of serum cholinesterase levels, 23% of the patients were those who were having severe inhibition of the cholinesterase level, which is defined as less than 10% of the activity of these enzymes. So in our study, based on the plasma glucose level, we divide our patients into normoglycemics, hypoglycemics, and hyperglycemics. Among the patients, 14% of the patients were hypoglycemics and 30% of the patients were hyperglycemic, constituting 44% of the patients which had dysglycemia. Among these patients, 51% of the patients had glycosuria, and among those, 21% were those patients who had glycosuria associated with hyperglycemia. So further analyzing those patients who had severe cholinesterase suppression, we found that patients in the hypoglycemic group, among those, 38% of the patients had severe cholinesterase suppression. Similarly, among the hyperglycemic group, 44 patients had the severe cholinesterase suppression, compared to only 7% of the patients in the normoglycemic group, indicating that the cholinesterase suppression was more seen in those patients who are either having hypoglycemia or were hyperglycemic. Further, on correlation analysis, we found that those patients with hyperglycemia, this hyperglycemia had a positive correlation, negative correlation with the cholinesterase suppression. However, those with hypoglycemia had a positive correlation with the cholinesterase suppression. Similarly, based on the POP scale severity, which determines the severity of organophosphorus poisoning, we found that those patients in the hypoglycemic group, 74% of the patients had moderate organophosphorus poisoning and 19% had severe poisoning. Similarly, in the hyperglycemic group, 64% had moderate and 31% had severe poisoning. Again, this parameter indicates that those patients who had hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia had the severity of organophosphoric poisoning either moderate or severe, indicating that those patients with either hypo or hyperglycemia had increased severity of organophosphorus poisoning. Now, coming to the complication part, as far as the glycemia was concerned, it was found that those patients with the hyperglycemia, 84% of the patients had complications. Similarly, with the hypoglycemia, 82% of patients of this group had complications. As far as the hospital stay was concerned, 60% of the patients in the hypoglycemia group and 66% of the patients in the hyperglycemia group had prolonged hospital stay that was defined as hospital stay of more than 7 days. Similarly, high dependency unit care was needed in hyperglycemic patients in 79.3% of the patients and hypoglycemic patients in 86.4% of patients, compared to 27% of the patients in the normoglycemic group. Similarly, mechanical ventilation again was needed in those patients who were either hypoglycemic or hyperglycemic in 67% of patients with hypoglycemia and 71% of patients with hyperglycemia, compared to those in the normoglycemia where high mechanical ventilation was needed only in 23% of the patients. As far as the mortality outcome was concerned, those patients in the hypoglycemic group, they had 33% mortality. 35% was observed in the hyperglycemic group, translating in an overall mortality of 17% in these patients. So with this, we conclude that glycemic extremes, including both hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia, are common in patients with acute organophosphorus poisoning. Extremes of glycemic status at presentation was significantly associated with clinical severity in the form of increased organophosphorus poisoning, depression in the serum cholinesterase levels, prolonged hospital stay, need for ICU care, and mechanical ventilation besides mortality. Thus, glycemic status at presentation can be used as a simple, cheap, reliable marker of clinical severity and outcome, along with the clinical severity scores in resource limited country like us. Thus, it can be used as a predictive marker to identify patients in need of intensive monitoring and admission to ICU care. Thank you very much. Any questions, please?
Thank you, Dr. Javed. And we are moving further for the next paper. Next paper is going to be presented by Miss Arpita Chakraborty, and she is going to speak on sphingolipids analysis in type 2 diabetes mellitus patient with cognitive dysfunction through targeted lipidomic approach, a cross-sectional study from South India.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Dr. Javed, can you please stop sharing? Yeah. Over to you, Ms.
Yes, sir. I will share the screen. Is it visible, sir?
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Today's topic, I will be presenting on the topic sphingolipids analysis in type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction through targeted lipidomics approach, a cross-sectional study from South India. So I will be moving on to the introduction first. Lipids such as glycerophospholipids, glycerolipids, sphingolipids, prenols, sterols, saccharides, and polyketides are found to be abundantly present in the brain. These lipids play active roles in maintaining brain structural and functional components as well as to maintain physiological functions of the neurons. These sphingolipids are found to be in higher concentration in the brain than in the plasma. So sphingolipid species such as sphingomyelin, galactosylceramide, and sulfatides are enriched in oligodendrocytes and myelin, and the sphingolipid profile in brain continuously changes as the age advances. So performing sphingolipids analysis of the serum samples from type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction and its comparison without cognitive dysfunction can provide us an insight into the role of these molecules in management of such cases. It may also help to identify a novel marker for future management of cognitive dysfunction in type 2 diabetes patients. Moving on to the methodology part, the serum samples were stored at minus 80 degrees centigrade freezer
Your
after
screen
collection.
is not moving. Sorry to interrupt, Arpita. I think your screen
Yes,
is
one moment.
not moving.
Uh, Sir, is it visible now?
Yes, your screen is visible.
It's moving. Sir, is it moving? The slides?
No, it's not moving.
Sir, are the slides moving now?
Yeah, perfect. Moving now.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Sorry for the interruption. Shall I continue from
Can you
where I
please?
left, sir?
No issue. Can you please put it on full screen mode?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you should.
So I basically talked
if
about this.
possible, put full screen mode.
Hello. Yes, sir.
If possible, put it on full screen mode.
Yeah, I have put it on full screen mode only, sir.
You no issue. You can carry on.
Okay, sir. I have now dealing on to the methodology part. So I have the serum samples after collection were stored at -80 degrees centigrade, and it was transported to C-Camp NCBS mass spectrometry facility, Bangalore. So 10 microliter of the serum samples were utilized for targeted lipidomics, and the samples were analyzed by LCMS method. Mass spectrometry was calibrated using these samples. Now 10 microliter samples in 1.5 ml capacity Eppendorf tube was taken, and 10 microliter of the splash standard was spiked in it with equal volume of methanol, chloroform and 0.89% potassium chloride. Vortex was done for 1 minute and incubation was done at 37 degrees centigrade for 10 minutes. Centrifugation was done at 10,000 rpm at 4 degrees centigrade for 5 minutes. The lower organic phase was separated into clean test tubes, and equal volume of chloroform and 0.89% potassium chloride were added to the original Eppendorf tube containing the upper layer. The steps 3 and 4 were repeated, and the lower organic phase into the same 1.5 ml test tube was collected. The solvents were evaporated to dryness in gentle nitrogen steam, and the residue was reconstituted in 200 microliter of methanol. From this, 5 microliter was injected into the LC analytical column with a flow rate of 300 microliter per minute. Now, the buffers used for these samples were acetonitrile and water with ammonium formate with 0.1% formic acid. The buffer which was used was isopropanol and acetonitrile with ammonium formate with 0.1% formic acid. So basically the instrument which was used was Arbitraft with 1,40,000 resolution. Positive and ion modes were selected according to which the lipid classes were subdivided. The mass spectrometry scan range was taken as 200 to 1200. The maximum injection time was 1550. The detector type was high resolution, high resolution mass spectrometry with high collision energy. The fragmentation energy was 25 to 40 with mass spectrometry scan range of 50 to 1200. This is the basic baseline characteristics of type 2 diabetes patients with the cognitive dysfunction and without CD. The age, BMI, glycated hemoglobin, TC, TG were found to be LDL cholesterol were found to be elevated in type 2 diabetes with CD. However, HDL was found to be decreased. Duration of diabetes, vitamin B12 and TSH was also increased in type 2 diabetes patients with CD, but education was found to be less in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. Now, these are the 173 classes of lipids which were identified in our samples. 32 species of ceramide, 6 species of glucosyl ceramide, and 6 species of ceramide phosphate were identified. Ceramide phosphoryl ethanolamine were 4 species of ceramide phosphoryl ethanolamine were identified. 22 species of monohexosyl ceramide, 28 species of dihexosyl ceramide, and 2 species of trihexosyl ceramides were identified.
Sorry to interrupt, Arpitas. I think your slides still are not moving. There is some issue.
Is it not moving, sir?
Yeah, now it is there. So just scroll on. Now it is moving.
Okay, sir. So now moving on to the results. Okay, the ceramide species were found to be ceramide species were found to be increased in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. Hexosyl ceramide and dihexosyl ceramide were also found to be increased in increased in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. All these lipid species has had significant association with type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction. Now moving on to the next slide, this is the comparison of species of ceramides in type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction and without cognitive dysfunction. This is a graph which presents the different ceramide subspecies between type 2 diabetes patients without CD and with CD. This graph presents the comparison of different ceramide phosphorylethanolamine species between type 2 diabetes patients without CD and with CD. And this graph presents the comparison of different glucosyl ceramide species between type 2 diabetes patients without CD and with CD. Now, this is the overall graph which I have put, and here you can see there is significant change in the ceramide D18:1 to 24:1 species, and it is highly elevated in type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction. Moving on to the next slide, this is the distribution of species of hexaceramide in type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction. And this is the overall graph in which presents our different monohexacyl ceramide species, where we can find hexacyl ceramide D16:0, 22:6 is greater in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. This is the overall graph of a dihexacyl ceramide species between the two groups, and this is the overall graph between the trihexacyl ceramide between two groups. However, no significant differences were observed in between these two groups. So this is the concentration of different sphingomyelin species between type 2 diabetes, and here also we didn't find any significant association in between both the groups. Now moving on to the discussion part, our study found significant higher levels of ceramide, monohexacyl ceramide and dihexacyl ceramide in type 2 diabetes patients with CD compared to that of non-CD, whereas in other study we found significant rise in ceramide and hexacyl ceramide levels by 2 times. The significant decline of ceramide species were observed in HDL fraction of Alzheimer's disease patients in this same study, which proved similar findings to our study findings. One study proved contrary results, as ceramide levels were found to be unaltered in mild cognitive impairment, young and old dementia patients. Another study showed a cognitive decline in ceramide levels in vascular dementia patients, which were also contrary to our study findings. The significant increase in ceramide and this monohexacyl and dihexacyl ceramides might be due to the fact that elevated ceramide can cause vascular constriction and ischemic damage in the vasculature by increasing thromboxane 2 release. Elevated ceramide can also impede ceramide synthase activity, which could contribute to some of the metabolic abnormalities in type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction. Moving on to the conclusion, ceramide, monohexacyl and dihexacyl ceramide are promising subspecies of sphingolipids which can increase the reliability of clinical diagnosis of cognitive dysfunction in type 2 diabetes patients. Large-scale confirmation studies are required in order to prove that these lipids need to be further explored for their specific role in cognitive functions. These are my references. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Arpita. Do we have any questions from the expert? So now we are moving ahead for the next paper. And next paper is going to be presented by Dr. Deepayan Roy. He is going to speak on visceral adipose tissue SMAD7 and MIR18-1-beta-5P possibly regulate insulin resistance in obesity. Over to you, Dr. Deepayan. You can now share your screen.
Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay. So I am starting my presentation. Is the screen visible?
Yeah, screen is visible. You can just put it on presentation mode.
Okay.
Full screen mode. Yeah.
So the topic is visceral adipose tissue SMAD7 and microRNA 181B5P possibly regulate the insulin resistance in obesity. So obesity is a burning health issue, and it is associated with an array of metabolic abnormalities such as insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes mellitus, and associated with diabetes associated several complications. The visceral adipose tissue is the primary machinery behind obesity and obesity related metabolic complications. And also it has a primary role to play in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. Now SMAD7 is SMAD7 is an inhibitory SMAD, and it belongs to a class of transcription factors which impacts the obesity associated metabolism, and its altered expression is associated with altered TGF beta signaling, which is known to induce the insulin resistance in case of pre-diabetics in obese individuals. MicroRNA are short non-coding RNAs which have a role in development of insulin resistance in obese individuals. In this study, we had considered the microRNA 181B5P, which has been said to be a potential marker of type 2 diabetes, and it has been shown in previous studies that it is upregulated in case of diabetic cardiomyopathy patients. So the aim of the study was basically to analyze the visceral adipose tissue expression of the microRNA 181B5P and SMAD7 in obese pre-diabetic individuals, and also whether there was an association of these two expressions with insulin resistance. Coming to methodology, we had recruited patients who were aged 18 to 60 years, and obesity and pre-diabetic condition were determined according to standard criteria, where obesity was determined as BMI greater than 30, and pre-diabetes was determined as fasting blood sugar of 100 to 125 milligram per dl, or HbA1c levels 5.6 to 6.4% without any previous diagnosis of diabetes. And exclusion criteria were thyroid disorders, cancers, and any other existing inflammatory conditions, as these might affect the expressions of the microRNA 181B and SMAD7. So the patients were recruited. We recruited 17 obese pre-diabetics and 31 healthy controls, and the fasting venous blood as well as visceral adipose tissue were collected. So these were basically patients who were going into surgery, and this blood was collected before the surgical procedure, and the visceral adipose tissue was collected during the surgical procedure. So in the clinical chemistry, the fasting blood sugar, HbA1c, and lipid profiles were determined, and also serum insulin was determined by chemiluminescence immunoassay. The insulin resistance was then calculated according to the HOMA model in HOMA IR, HOMA beta, and HOMA sensitivity, and according to total cholesterol to HDL, triglyceride to HDL, and triglyceride glucose index. So total RNA was extracted from the visceral adipose tissue using the trizol method, and then from the total RNA, the cDNA was converted using reverse transcription kit, and then the real-time PCR was run on CFX96 machine. Fold change expression of SMAD7 and MIR181B5P were calculated with GAPDH and RNU6 using GAPDH and RNU6 respectively as internal controls. So coming to the results, So the two groups in this study, they differed significantly in the following parameters: the body mass index, the waist to hip ratio, the HbA1c and fasting blood sugar, the total cholesterol and triglyceride from the lipid profile, and fasting insulin, as well as the HOMA-IR index. The other insulin resistance indices were not significantly different between the groups. Now coming to the correlation analysis. So MIR 181b5p was seen to be significantly and positively correlated to these following parameters: the fasting blood sugar, the HbA1c, the fasting insulin, and the HOMA-IR. And as we can see, there was a weak to moderate correlation between all these parameters, and they were all statistically significant. Now coming to the fold change, the MIR 181b5p was 10.85 times upregulated in the obese pre-diabetic group compared to the control group. Next, we came to the SMAD7, and the SMAD7 was 2.5 times down-regulated in the obese pre-diabetic group compared to the control group. So now the discussion part. So the obesity is a chronic low-grade inflammatory condition, and it has been shown before that the SMAD signaling pathway, including the inhibitory SMAD7, is involved in the development of insulin resistance through the TGF-beta signaling pathway. The TGF-beta induces the SMAD7 and inhibits the SMAD2/3 and induces this insulin resistant state. So SMAD7 has also been previously significantly associated with HOMA-IR, and in this study we had shown that it was downregulated in the obese pre-diabetic patients. In the contrary, the MIR 181b5p was upregulated, and this might be having an inhibitory effect on the SMAD7 and regulating the insulin resistance in the pre-diabetic patients. The downregulation of SMAD7 in obese pre-diabetics we can say that promotes the TGF-beta signaling and causes this insulin resistance. The limitation of this study was the small sample size, but the findings can be validated in large groups. So to conclude, the MIR 181b5p is a possible regulatory player in obese individuals for the development of insulin resistance, and SMAD7 can be a therapeutic target in obese non-diabetics for the insulin prevention of insulin resistance. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your paper, Dr. Deepayan. Do we have any questions from the expert? Fine. So we are moving on for the next paper. It's by Dr. Arbinder Singhal, and is going to speak on real-world effectiveness of Diabifly Pro digital therapeutic program for improving postprandial glycemic response in people with diabetes through personalized coaching. Over to you, Dr. Arbinder.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving me this opportunity. I'm a pediatric urologist by profession, but I was diagnosed with pre-diabetes. That's how I'm here, and this platform was tested on me. So I'm just happy to be in this elite symposium and this conference. So this study was done across multiple centers of India, right from Navi Mumbai to Haryana to Thane to multiple cities and hospitals, where we took patients with type 2 diabetes into a Diabifly Pro digital therapeutics program. So postprandial hyperglycemia has been associated with the development of complications in type 2 diabetes, and we all know heavy carbohydrate-rich meals are a problem with people with diabetes. CGM devices have been available in India for many years, and they have been used by doctors for understanding glycemic variability. But we believe that it can have a far more importance in terms of behavioral modification and coaching the patients. So what we created is a software which can understand personalized glycemic response for these patients. And then we layered on top of it a Dibifly Pro digital therapeutic program, which coaches the patient on making those changes in their diet and fitness. So the aim of this study was to analyze the effectiveness of Dibifly Pro digital therapeutic program for improvement of postprandial hyperglycemia. The study group consisted of 200 plus patients, mean age of 48 years. Males were 42% and females were 58%. We calculated the net area under curve using the trapezoidal rule for period. So the program was split into two phases. First 7 days was the observation phase. On day 7, we took the patient on a video call and we analyzed their glycemic responses to various foods. And then we gave them the coaching over next 7 days to change those foods. And then we calculated the incremental area under curve again. And we used a pair t-test for measuring this. What we also did was we segregated these areas under curves for various meals during the day. Just to briefly touch upon what we do in Dibifly program, a patient gets a wellness app where they record whatever they eat into the app, even by pictures or database. The coach can see all this data on the back end and they can correlate it with the CGMS findings. Most of our patients, as you can see, were referred by doctors. Step 1 including collection of data, diet, exercise, stress and sleep pattern. This data was analyzed against the CGMS and for first 14 days and then SMBG values. Issues were identified. Therapy was changed by the doctors, the medicine dosage, but the rest of the part around diet, exercise and stress was managed by us. Now, a term of personalized glycemic response we found was very exciting because we realized when people were eating various kinds of food, their blood sugar were rising to a different level. So we actually coined the term at Fitterfly, calling it a personalized glycemic response. And this varies from people to people, even with living with the same genetics in the same house. How do we calculate PGR? By using Abbott Libre Pro device, by using Fitterfly Wellness app and a coach who does all this software calculation. Fitterfly has built India's largest food database, so that is pretty helpful whether it's a Gujarati cuisine or a South Indian cuisine or a Assamese cuisine. This is example of my own PGR where you can see my blood sugars rising with each of the foods. Foods rich in starch such as Maggi, they raised my blood sugar above 140 every single time I ate them, and the area under the curve was more for these foods. Another example with white bread toast, my blood sugars uniformly rose above 150 and this was again the area under curve was more for this particular food. Now for patients, this is the kind of graphs they get to see. What is the blood sugar rise with each of these foods? These are the examples of 2 foods which rapidly raise the blood sugars. And these are the examples of 2 snacks which actually did not raise the blood sugar so much. So this kind of pictorial representation, for example, this is one case study where a 53-year-old female with almost a normal BMI with a HbA1c of 15% joined the program. She was on insulin, glimepiride, metformin and acarbose. You can see at the beginning of the program, post-meal hyperglycemia is quite high post-breakfast and post-dinner with only 44% TIR. With coaching, this improves to 73% within a week's time and no hypoglycemia. So her 3 months outcomes, she could achieve a lot of improvement in HbA1c based on this coaching. Now to come to the overall results of these 200 patients, the total glucose area under curve decreased from 3600 milligram per deciliter R to 3543 milligram per deciliter R, which is statistically significant. Then we analyzed this data for the various meals of the day. For breakfast, again, actually the reduction was quite significant. We could feel that we are making a significant difference in the type of meals which the people are consuming during breakfast. Similarly, during lunch also. But the biggest difference which we could make was during the snacks. During the snacks time, the difference in IAUC was quite significant, and similarly for the dinner hours. So these 2 meals we found were a significant problem in the patients who were joining our program, and specifically during snacks and dinner, if we could help them manage better meals, it definitely decreased the rise of glucose post-meal. To conclude my paper, there can be a significant improvement in postprandial glycemic response if you use CGMS not only for deciding the medical therapy, but also for helping them decide for better foods. Personalized glycemic response based coaching and diet plans are a visual indication because people do not make change just because doctor like me or you are telling them something to do. The moment you show them their own data of what they are eating, how it is affecting their blood sugars, they are able to make that dedicated change. In here, there is a Pareto principle called the 80-20 rule. If we can find those 20% of the meals which are responsible for 80% of hyperglycemic episodes, and change the portion size, composition of the meal, timing of the meal, combination of the foods, or even as simple as exercise for going for 5 minutes of walk post meal, that can really improve the time in range. We believe that lifestyle coaching based on insights on personalized glycemic response should become a standard of care for type 2 diabetes management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Arvinder, for this paper.
Happy to take any questions, sir. I'm ahead of time, I know that. But generally this session is running on time, which is so good.
Yes. So let us move on the next session from Dr. Arutselvi Devarajan, and she's going to speak on rate of declining kidney function and its determinant among the people with type 2 diabetes, a 4 years observational study from South India. Over to you, Dr. Arutselvi Devarajan. You can share your screen now.
1 second, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. My topic is on rate of declining kidney function and its determinants among people with type 2 diabetes. 4 years observational study from South India. Background and aim of the study. Kidney disease predisposes individual to excess morbidity and mortality resulting in renal failure and CVD. DKD develops in 40% of patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus. The overall odds of developing CKD in patients with diabetes was around 1.75 in low and middle income countries, whereas South Asian population it was 3.14. There is little data from India on the decline in kidney function and its determinants among people with type 2 DM. Hence, the aim of this study was to see the rate of decline in kidney function among people with type 2 DM and also the factors associated with declining kidney function. Methods and materials. This is a retrospective observational study conducted among people with type 2 DM who attended MV Hospital for Diabetes Chennai from 2016 to 2019. We included people with eGFR greater than 60 in 2016 and collected socio-demographic, anthropometric, clinical, and biochemical variables from the electronic medical records for all the follow-up visits every year till 2019. eGFR was calculated based on CKD EPI equation. The onset of complications and comorbid condition and the details of medication were noted during the study period. Individuals who had information, that is n equal to 95 for all the study variables, were included in the analysis. Student t-test, chi-square test, and multiple linear regression were performed using SPSS version 24. Results. This table actually shows the basic clinical biochemical parameters among these study participants at baseline and follow-up. The average age of the participants at baseline was 51 plus or minus 7.1. Duration of diabetes was 11 plus or minus 6.7 years. You can see the change that occurred in the parameters from baseline to follow-up that is significantly varied in HbA1c and total cholesterol and LDL and non-HDL, but whereas only HbA1c shows significant increase, whereas other lipid parameters shows little reduction, and whereas AC ratio, you can see the increase and eGFR decrease. Table 2 shows the treatment details and prevalence of complications among these study participants. We can see the difference in the combination treatment, anti-diabetic treatment, combination of OHA plus insulin, that is 43.2% are on combination, sorry, 33.6% on combination, follow-up, whereas only 1% were on OHA and insulin at baseline. And the presence of hypertension was tremendously increased from 5% to 5.3% to 43.2%. And antihypertensive treatment also showed a significant difference in the use of angiotensin II receptor blocker, combination of 2 or more antihypertensive drugs, and lipid-lowering drugs. Presence of complication also significantly increased in the presence of diabetic retinopathy, diabetic neuropathy, and also CVD. And you can see the difference and the decline of eGFR during follow-up from baseline every year. And that is also significantly different from baseline. And the figure shows the rate of decline in mean eGFR every year from baseline. So gradually, if we see, it is 15.7% from baseline. And the proportion of the participants with declining function in each follow-up, we categorized them, the group into two who had eGFR greater than 90 or equal to, greater than or equal to 90, and who were having 60 to 89. And you can see the declining kidney function in group 1 and group 2, how it has progressed gradually. And you can see this decline very, significant rise in each year. Factors associated with declining eGFR. When we included the variables such as gender, age, duration of diabetes, BMI, systolic BP, diastolic BP, HbA1c, fasting glucose, postprandial glucose, total cholesterol, triglycerides as predictor variables against dependent variable mean eGFR. This model actually showed us age, duration of diabetes, postprandial glucose, and triglycerides are likely to be more associated with the declining eGFR. And HbA1c actually failed to achieve the significance, but it is actually showing that for every 1 point of HbA1c increase, there will be a decrease in 2 units of eGFR. It may be due to the sample size, smaller sample size, the significance was not achieved. So when in the model 2, we included complications, presence of complications, and logarithm of ACR. ACR actually was not normally distributed, so we took a logarithm of ACR. So when we added along with the first model, the complications and the logarithm of ACR, here we had gender, age, and logarithm of ACR. It actually give the high significance compared to other variables. Again, duration of DEM and triglycerides did not achieve the statistical significance. Discussion. The present study used eGFR as an indicator to assess the declining kidney function, whereas previous studies used albuminuria to assess the kidney function. Our previous study with a median follow-up of 11 years in subjects with normal renal function at baseline showed that 44.1% developed proteinuria at follow-up. The present study showed that 21% of the subjects had eGFR less than 60 at the end of the 4 years. The same study showed that duration of diabetes, systolic BP, HbA1c, triglyceride level, and the presence of a diabetic retinopathy were associated with the development of proteinuria, while the present study showed that mean eGFR was associated with increased age, male gender, longer duration of diabetes, high levels of postprandial glucose, triglyceride, and albuminuria. Conclusion. A significant fall in the mean eGFR was evident over a period of 4 years from 2016 to 2019. There was also a rapid rise in the presence of comorbid condition, hypertension, and complications such as neuropathy, retinopathy, and cardiovascular disease from baseline to follow-up. The factors associated with declining kidney function were age, male gender, duration of diabetes, postprandial glucose, triglyceride levels, and albuminuria. Thank you.